Good evening. This is Truth Seeker here. And as I promised earlier, we're going to be taking a look at the 2018 Watchtower statistics. They're published annually every year by the Watchtower. They've done so for the past 80 years or so. And it's done with the idea in mind of showing the great and grand and glorious work of how Jehovah is blessing the Watchtower's efforts as they present a worldwide witness. Lloyd Evans very adeptly points out that they really haven't done what they claim to have done. That there are many areas of the world that are not being getting the same level of attention from Jehovah, apparently, as others. That Jehovah has some countries that he favors. And what I have here is the overall summary data that Watchtower puts together. And I've taken 2017 and 2018 to show what the differences are. And there's some surprising changes here. Unless you've been following the recent videos that many of the activists have put on, you'll know about some of these things, such as the shutting down of branches. The Watchtower had more than 90 branches, and now in just between 2017 and 2018, they've shut down 3 branches, and they're consolidating as much as they can with their properties. It's evident here. You can see that there's a decline in the number of congregations worldwide. Memorial attendance is up by 0.76%. And now this is an interesting statistic, because in 2005, there was a minimum in the number of memorial partakers of about 1,000. By 8,000. It was down to 8,000, and now it's up to 19,000. This is more than they had since the 1950s. I believe in the 1940s or 50s may have been the last time the memorial partakers have been this high. And the increase is substantial. You can see that the number is 5.16%. When you look at a growth rate of the average publishers of 1.35%, the memorial partakers are growing at a greater rate than the peak publishers. Although it's still a very rare thing to see somebody partaking of the memorial in the Jehovah's Witnesses, because of such large numbers of the great crowd versus those that claim to be of the anointed class. So it's a fascinating phenomena to see this growth, this rapid growth in the number of partakers in the memorial. I don't think that the governing body particularly cares for this particular statistic, and they seem to try to discourage people by suggesting that those that are partaking of the memorial might not be of sound mind. Number of baptisms is down by several thousand in 2018 from 2017, despite the substantial increase in the hours in the field. These are witnessing hours in the door-to-door service. There's been an increase of 1.4% in the amount of time that people spend in the field, and yet there's a decline in the number of baptisms overall. And these are worldwide statistical figures, which give sort of an overall picture of the what's going on with the society as a whole. The average Bible studies is something similar to the service. If you compared the fact that you have um, an increase of by about 8,000 hours in or 8,000 studies, average Bible studies per month, you see that there's a decline in the number of baptism. It means that the witness effort isn't particularly effective, and we'll be looking at some graphs that show that aspect a little bit more succinctly. Now, here's a graph that I think you might find interesting. This is the overall growth rate of the Jehovah's Witnesses since 1962. And as you can see here, it's been a pretty linear growth. Although earlier in time, when you talk about the late 1950s, early 1960s, the growth rate was a little bit more steep in those years than in from 1990 on. It seems pretty steady, regular growth rate from 1990 to the present time. The correlation coefficient here indicates that the trending is pretty certain here, that there isn't much variance here, not a whole lot of variability, that this increase is indeed associated with growth, although the growth rate itself is not very strong in recent years. And when you look at some of the early years back in the 1960s, you'll see, and we'll have a graph that shows this, that the percent increase from year to year was substantially more than what it is today. There were years where there was double-digit growth from one year to the next in the numbers of converts into the Jehovah's Witnesses back in the early 60s. And now it's down into the single digits. It's the year previous, it was 1.4%. Now, this year, it's 1.35%. Watchtower reports 1.4, but because they're rounding the 5 up to make it 1.4, to make it look a little better, they try at least to make things look a little less as bad as they used to be, or than they really are. The interesting thing is, I think that the 1.35% may be the lowest percentage or rate of growth in the past 60 or 70 years that Watchtower has seen. So we're seeing some substantial changes. The thing is, though, when you have 1% of 8 million people, or 5% of 800,000 people, there's a substantial number, absolute number change in, there's a big difference in the absolute numbers we're talking about. So 1% can still be a fairly large number of people. It's just that the growth rate itself is beginning to slow down. And that eventually does impact on the numbers of people who join. Eventually, this linear relationship will curve over and flatten out when the growth rate becomes 0%, and it may actually hump over, and you may begin to see a decline in the numbers. So and you do see that in on this graph. You don't see it as well, but around 1975, if you take a look in that time frame, you'll see a little dip in the curve. And you see for several years there, from 1975 to about 1980, that the curve is flat. And there was an actual decline at that time. That was the infamous 1975 debacle for Watchtower. I have some graphs that show that decline in much greater detail and much more magnified than this graph, but you do see it in this graph. Watchtower didn't recover from the 1975 prediction that the kingdom would begin in 1975 for a number of years, and you could see that from about 1980 on, there was a turn to more rapid growth, and you do see some steeper growth rate at that point, which then again changes around 1995, and you see a slowing down of the growth rate from about 1995 to the present. So we do see substantial, growth in the Watchtower over these past 60 years. From about 1 million people in 1960 to over 8 million. It's about 8.5 million today. So there has been quite a few people that have joined the Watchtower in that period of time. But the rate of growth is certainly something that's changing for Watchtower. Now here's a graph that shows something that's really fascinating. This is basically the effectiveness of the preaching work. This is the ratio of the number of baptisms to the number of hours that are spent in the field service. So the number of baptisms, where it was about 281,000 baptisms for 2018, divided by the over 2 billion hours that was spent preaching in the field to basically get people to come to baptism. And so this is sort of a chart that shows the effectiveness of that preaching work. And again, it goes back to the early 60s. Now, I did what they call a 5-year rolling average. And basically, I take each individual point for 5 years, and then I divide that sum by 5 and make an individual point out of that. And what that does is it smooths out the variability in the data. It's a statistical technique to show dampen out the noise, basically, in the data, because data will have inherent noise within it. And so any patterns that may show up will stand out more readily when you do a 5-year rolling average. And here you can see that this has taken out the noise or the variability out of the data very nicely. Um, Here we see some very fascinating stuff. Now, again, I said this was the number of baptisms divided by the 2 billion hours of preaching. But again, I multiplied by 100,000. So this is baptisms per 100,000 hours of preaching. Okay, so in other words, there are 70 baptisms. In 1975, you can attribute 70 baptisms to 100,000 hours of preaching. It took 100,000 hours of field service work to get a result in 70 baptisms. And so that is what that means, and it shows you the degree to which this is why Watchtower requires absolute loyalty and demands from their members the to be put to work in the field and to get this to get this door to door done, because it takes a tremendous tremendous effort to get people to respond and join the religion. Now we see an interesting thing here from 1960 to 65. We see that there's a little bit of a decline in the growth rate, and all of a sudden you see this big hump from 1965 to about 1975, and then it declines substantially after 1975. That that is associated with the preaching of and the expectation that Armageddon was going to come in 1975, that the kingdom would begin in 1975. And that was preached by the Watchtower. This was Fred Franz, who was the theologian, the key theologian behind that doctrine. And many people got on the bandwagon and really were excited, and they pushed this idea that the kingdom was going to start in 1975. There were slogans, "Stay alive to 75," and people were selling their homes and going into the field service, and really pulling in large numbers of people with the idea that the kingdom was going to begin in 1975. As a Bible student, I recall I was only 20 years old in 1975, and I remember going to the New Brunswick Bible Students Convention, 4th of July convention, and the buzz was all over the convention that the kingdom was going to begin in 1975. Even though the Bible students didn't buy into Watchtower chronology, the Watchtower had so publicized this date that even some Bible students were talking about it, and I can recall hearing about it talked about in the Bible students. Not that the Bible students necessarily agreed with the chronology, but it was something because Bible students do pay attention to the Watchtower because of the past connection that the Bible students had with the Watchtower. So, but then you see the great disappointment, I guess you could call it. That is kind of what happened with the William Miller movement. Uh, in 1975, you saw a decline, an actual decline in the numbers of people that called themselves Jehovah's Witnesses. For several years, there was a decline in the growth rate. This rolling average actually smooths that out, so you don't really see that dip graphically, but you do see this. You do see that sudden decrease, and then you see a gradual decline from about 1980 to the present time, which we're almost to 2020 at this point. But if you notice, there's been a steady, almost linear decline in the effectiveness in the witness work. So there's no matter what seems to be, no matter what Watchtower seems to be doing, the effectiveness of their preaching is in decline. It's not working. The formula is not working anymore. It's losing, and you can only cry wolf so many times. And when you do cry wolf, it's only a momentary thing. As you can see here, the business lasted only about a decade before it backfired on Watchtower. Now here's a graph here that plots a scatter plot of the number of congregations from the early 1960s to the present time. And you can see that there has been substantial growth to accommodate the growth in the movement on a worldwide basis. You can see in the earlier years that there's been a little bit more variability, that there was slower growth in the early 60s, but then around 1970, there was a little bit of an increase in the rate at which Kingdom Halls were being built to accommodate that blip that we saw in the increase in the number of witnesses that were responding to this Kingdom 1975 Kingdom call. But the rate at which Kingdom Halls have been built has been relatively steady. It's been relatively linear over the years, which is something that you would expect. It follows the growth rate that we saw earlier in the earlier chart of the actual growth rate in numbers of Jehovah's Witnesses. However, in the last several years, we see something here that is kind of interesting. For the last 3 years, you see a decline in the number of congregations, and that is beginning at around 2016, where we see the peak at about a little more than 120,000 congregations. And there's been a flattening out, and actual this year from 2017 to 2018, there's been a decline in the number of congregations. So that is indicative of something that's happening. We see that the effectiveness of the preaching work is in decline. We also see that the number of individuals, the rate at which individuals were joining, is also not as robust as it used to be. And here we see that the number of congregations is in decline, and that could be from a number of reasons. One reason could be that the Watchtower is beginning to feel the financial impact of the lawsuits being brought against them for the sex abuse scandals, the child sex abuse scandals. Some of these judgments have been in the tens of millions. The recent Montana judgment was $35 million against Watchtower. Now, Watchtower has quite a bit of real estate, and it appears that this could be as a result of liquidating some of their assets to accommodate, to they have a certain budget set aside for the work that they plan to get done, and they're finding that they've had to cut back. They've admitted that they've had to cut back on the amount of work because they just didn't. It was too expensive for them, and they weren't getting enough donations. Um, there was some data that I found some 2002 that indicated that Watchtower was in the top 40 earners in New York businesses at close to $1 billion a year revenues. I don't know where they got those numbers from, but I believe that they're probably accurate. It may have been some inside information that they got that somebody leaked out to Newsweek, and they reported it. But also, we know that they made a substantial amount of money with the Brooklyn properties because those properties had been paid off, bought back in the early 1900s, and through the 1920s and 30s when the properties were cheap, and now they're worth billions of dollars, and so the Watchtower made a windfall profit on those properties. They have money, but it's whether or not that money is allocated to the work that they have budgeted, and the lawsuits certainly are putting a dent into Watchtower's ability to conduct its work. And as you can see, when you have 8 billion people doing 2 billion hours of door to door witness for you, this is not a cheap endeavor. There's a lot of expenditure that goes into this. The Bethels, they're at one point there were over 20,000 individuals working globally for Watchtower at the Bethels. They needed housing, foods, and shelter, so they put them up. There is overhead for this. There's overhead for the governing body, and I'm sure the governing body is not. They don't make as much as the CEOs of many corporations, but I'm sure that they're not suffering any, and that their lifestyle is a little bit more extravagant than the average Jehovah's Witness. So I think we're beginning to see a little bit of the with this kind of data, we're beginning to see Watchtower begin to feel a financial pinch in having to liquidate their properties. This next slide is just a magnification of the previous slide and looking at the last several years for that bend over, I call it. This is a bending over of the growth rate, and you can see that it's pretty substantial. I've drawn a best curve line. I've got a pretty good fit through the data points of 98 with an R squared of 0.98. That indicates that I've got a pretty good fit. That this is indicative or suggestive of a trend that is going to occur and continue to occur, either a flattening out or an actual substantial decline from this point on. I think we've seen the peak of the number of congregations, and Watchtower is going to continue with the consolidation of of the of these congregations. What they're doing is closing up congregations and joining different congregations, all using this one facility instead of two facilities. And it's been a bit of a stir and disrupting the witness congregations. They've actually put out videos in their JW broadcasting that addresses this issue and criticizes those who may complain that by breaking up the congregation, they are splitting up families and so on. And so Watchtower has addressed this. This is not a fiction, and we can expect to see this trend continue because I think they need to liquidate these assets as rapidly as possible. Now, here's a table that I put together that addresses the negative growth rate in the country data. This is what Lloyd Evans had put together in graphical form, showing those countries, highlighting in different colors countries that we have negative growth rate and positive growth rate and flat growth rate. And basically, I took the 2018 data and I looked at all those countries that saw a decline in numbers, and then I looked at those countries where the growth rate was between 0 and less than 1. So basically, in the very, very, very small or almost flat growth rate. And then I looked at the countries that had a growth rate between 1 and 1.5%, and then those that had a growth rate of over 1.5%. And the results are pretty interesting. The number of countries that showed negative growth rate, again, now, because the average publisher data was not available, I had to use peak publisher data. Some of the results are a little bit different, but they do follow one another. Where you do have that data, the peak publisher data does follow the average publisher data pretty closely. So the results wouldn't be too terribly different if you had the average publisher data. Now, of the they claim 240 lands. When they look at the number of lands that their data covers, they say it covers 240 lands. But 33 of those lands are consolidated in one group called 33 lands, and they have one number for those 33 countries. But those 33 countries represent some 2 billion, something like 2.3 billion people. And so they're not trivial, even though there are only 230,000 Jehovah's Witnesses in those 33 lands. Those 33 lands also cover about a third of the planet's population. So what I did here was I looked at basically there are 208 data points, okay, because they lumped the 33 lands into one data point, and so we have basically 97, 107, 108, 208 lands altogether represented here and represented in their table of nations. And the number of countries where there is a negative growth rate represent over 30% or almost a third of the nations that Jehovah's Witnesses are active, within which that they're active. have shown a decline in the number of Jehovah's Witnesses. So the growth rate is negative in 66 countries, or almost 32% of the countries that they are active and report in. For the next category that I outlined, there were 31 nations that had a nearly flat growth rate that was less than 1%, but greater than zero. Uh, so there weren't that many nations, roughly 15% of the nations. So here we have 47%, or heading toward 50% of the countries. We're moving on 50% of the countries where there's either no growth rate or zero growth rate. So that is a very significant factor. And then looking at those countries that there's a growth rate between 1% and 1.5%. They're slow growing. There are not many of those. There are about 11 nations in that category, and then 100 countries in which the growth rate is greater than 1.5%. Although overall the growth rate is 1.35%. So when we are talking about countries that have a growth rate of over 1.5%, we're not talking about really large increases. We're not talking double-digit figures here for these countries. Although these 100 countries represent about almost 6 billion people, the greater part of the world. Uh, I'm using the latest wiki number of 7.7 billion. If you Google it and say what is the population of the world, they say 7.7 billion, and so that's what I'm using here. I summed up the numbers for the countries that showed these different, where that fell within these different categories. For example, in the countries where there was negative growth rate, represented about 702 million people, so less than a billion people were represented in those 66 countries. And there were about 1.2 million Jehovah's Witnesses in those nations. In the next category, you could see that there was closer to a billion people covered by that, and the number of Jehovah's Witnesses in those countries in that category were about 3.3 million Jehovah's Witnesses in that range, and so you can see how this table is constructed. Though while the greater number of people are covered in the greater than 1.5% growth rate, both in the population of the nations and in the number of Jehovah's Witnesses. In those three small growth categories, the 1 to 1.5%, the 0 to 1% negative growth, we have over 5 million Jehovah's Witnesses represented in that grouping, and those could be the nations in which there's greater internet access, and that accounts for the lower growth rate in amongst these countries. These are probably the higher developed countries. In the countries where there is less internet access, less ability to get information freely because of governmental, freedom of speech issues within a country. They probably are represented more in these higher growth, in that higher growth band of greater than 1.5%. And there are 100 nations represented in that. So that's roughly half of the countries that are reported by the Watchtower. I do think when you stop and you think that half of the countries that they report have growth that's essentially stagnated is a very substantial thing. It's a really a matter that would be of great concern if I were one of the governing body members and I was interested in growing the organization. I would be concerned with the numbers that I see here, especially with that the fact that half the people and half of the nations that have the greater part of the population, they're the ones where the greater growth rate is coming from. But as these nations gain access to information, as their economic conditions improve, these countries too will begin to stagnate in their growth. Now, here's an interesting chart. Again, it's a 5-year rolling average where I try to I use the 5-year rolling average as a means to smooth out some of the variability so that you can take a look at the trends. And the trends here over the past 60 some odd years are substantial. When I say 60, it's approximately 60, beginning in around 1960 to the present time. I'm 63. I was born in 55, so this covers roughly a 66 6 decades of time, roughly speaking. Especially the fact that a 5-year rolling average does shorten the data a little bit by some 2.5 years or so. Yeah. But when you look at this, you see that in the 1960s, in the early to mid 60s, things were beginning to decline. That may have been a trend that began in the 1950s. There was explosive growth in the 1940s and 50s, exponential. But all good things come to an end, and we begin to see very definitive decline in the early 1960s to around the middle of the decade, where all of a sudden there's a skyrocket. And again, we can attribute that to the 1975 promise that the kingdom would begin then, that Armageddon, the world was going to end in Armageddon in 1975, and God was going to put an end to Satan and this evil system of things, and he was going to establish Christ's kingdom on earth. Armageddon was going to, be, in short order. Everything was going to be done pretty quickly. Bible students and Jehovah's Witnesses have always expected that when the end does come, that it'll come quickly and that it won't linger. It will be something that occurs in a very short period of time. And Bible students still believe that, and I'm certain that that's something that Watchtower still adheres to. But we see that in the mid 70s, in the early to mid 70s, late 60s up to the mid 70s, skyrocketing growth and a plummet real plummet to the depths in 1980. Again, because this is a rolling average and it covers 5 years, it doesn't show that it's negative. And it actually dipped into the negatives for a couple of years right after 1975. Because of the disillusionment that many Jehovah's Witnesses had over this failed prediction, and they could attribute it directly to Fred Franz, although the Watchtower didn't want to take responsibility for it, and they never did apologize for misleading their followers for misrepresenting what to expect in 1975, and that was a direct misrepresentation. I mean, these were Watchtower leaders that were saying things like "stay alive to 75," and that they were printing articles in the Watchtower magazine and other their Awake magazine that indicated that the kingdom was going to begin in 1975. Like I said, I had even heard about it as a young man in the Bible students. So it was a very well known debacle. But the Watchtower rebounded pretty substantially, and I think the way that they dealt with Raymond Franz is how they stemmed the tide. The governing body uh, took advantage of the miscalculation, and really, basically, there was a leadership coup that took place, and the governing body came into being and took over. I mean, there was a governing body that began in name in the early 1970s, but they didn't really coalesce and as a power, as a consolidated power until the 1980s, 1970s, when they usurped the control away from the president. And Fred Franz apparently was walking a thin line. I mean, he was the architect of so much of the Watchtower's growth, but at the same time, he was rebutting and rebuffing the attempt to take over the by the governing body, and he was outwardly outspoken against the formation of the and taking control of the Watchtower by the governing body. Although he was overruled and started a new era for the leadership of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. And you can see the effect that this new leadership had. That from 1980, that 1980, you saw a rebound. But from 1985 and the mid 80s on, um, the this leadership change couldn't stem what was inevitable. There was a decline in the global percent rate of growth, and it was going to continue. And you could see that there was a pretty substantial dip from the late 90s to around 2010, where there was some rebound, but by 2010 to the present, over the last 8 or 9 years, uh, there's been a steady steady decline. And I think that really has to do, that marks pretty much the time of the activism. I think what we see from about 2010 on is when activists became much more vocal, much more active online, and began to have an impact on the growth and efforts of the Watchtower to grow its body. So that, I believe, those last few years that we see there from 2010 on, I think can be directly attributable to the activism and the voices of the ex Jehovah's Witness community, um, and and it's growing. Everybody has a voice, and everybody can contribute to the opposition of the abuses of Watchtower. I mean, Watchtower is one of those more abusive organizations where they certainly they're embroiled in the child sex abuse scandal, and they won't change their policies just out of plain stubbornness. I mean, there's no other reason for it to protect children against the pedophiles. I mean, the Watchtower is a pedophile heaven. I mean, they're more willing to forgive pedophiles and exact retribution against innocent children and innocent people who have been harmed by these dangerous and despicable individuals that have harmed children. And this responsibility directly is on the shoulders of the governing body. And same with the other ridiculous and dangerous policies that just don't make sense in today's society. The blood policy and shunning. Shunning, I think, has probably been, instead of stemming the tide, I think it's opening the eyes of the youth and saying, we want no part of this. If this is what you're going to do to us and separating our families, this is we want no part of this. We want nothing to do with this. And so the only way Watchtower can stem this to some extent is by using the shunning policy in connection, in tandem with child baptism, and having children and encouraging that children be baptized at age 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and enter into what Watchtower says is an irrevocable contract with Jehovah, and that if they back out of this agreement, then they should be punished by being separated from their families. And this actually puts young people in danger, and not only destroys families, but puts young people in danger. Talking about throwing young teenagers out of the home before they're able to take care of themselves, and forcing them to live out on the streets and in dangerous circumstances, all because of their, let's say, rejection of their religion. And the Watchtower does not encourage independent thinking whatsoever. But this is all going to come back. This will boomerang on them. And eventually, the younger generation, as time progresses, will eventually the trickle will become a flood as the walls crack and the leaks become irreparable for Watchtower. So um, it's happening, and it's happening soon. And we can see that this is what the data indicates. This is what these graphs are showing. Now, here's another graph. Again, another 5-year rolling average, mainly because I like the way it removes the variability, makes the data stand out a little bit more clearly. Um, but this is a rolling average over the past 60 years or so of the numbers of hours preached by each publisher each month. And you can see this has been an increasing trend. Now, there is a substantial increase in the number of monthly hours on average that each publisher has put in for their witnessing. You can see here in the 1960s, this 5-year rolling average was down around 12 to 13. It was below 13%. I mean, 13 hours. I'm sorry. It's not. This is not a percent. This is a straight number of hours of publishers preaching each month. I took the number of hours, the 2 billion hours, and um, I divided that by the number of publishers, and then divided that by 12. So I got a monthly rate for each publisher. So it's in the early 60s. You could see that the expectations placed on the publishers were only about less than 13 hours a month. That has risen to a present condition. Right now, it's at an all-time high of over 20 hours of um, uh, a month for each publisher on a global basis. And so this is a substantial thing because we see the numbers of baptisms not following this trend. The trend for the number of baptisms is not increasing in correlation with the increase in the number of hours that these publishers are putting in. So the effectiveness is not there. There's poor effectiveness, and I think I have a slide that shows that. But this slide here shows that there's the how there was an increase over time in the number of hours. Now you can see from 1980 there was a decline there. Again, that as peaked in 1975. You saw a rise, an increase in the number of hours preached in the 1960s and 70s. And then all of a sudden it declined to about 1980. Uh, People were disillusioned about the failure of the 1975 prediction. So to reverse that situation, Watchtower really put the pressure on their members, their publishers, and to substantially increase the number of hours that they preach door to door. Now that also happens to correlate with the time of this Revelation climax book, which seems to have gotten motivated a lot of witnesses into believing that the end was short. Yes, we made a mistake with 1975, but the time has got to be short. All of the evidence is pointing to it. Look at all the conditions in the world. Satan is running rampant. We've got to get that message out, and so you see a big increase in the 1980s and 90s in the number of hours expected. But then it was met with a slight decline again in the early 2000s, and then expectations again have been placed, and there's been an emphasis on pushing the numbers and getting the numbers up per publisher, and they're increasing. Right now, the hours put in by each publisher is at an all-time high for the each publisher doing door-to-door or service work. At least that's how the numbers shake out. How much we can trust these numbers, I don't know. But they're certainly not. It's certainly not resulting in the Kingdom Halls filling. The Kingdom Halls are in decline in the numbers, from what I understand. They don't publish those numbers, how many individuals belong and meet in each Kingdom Hall, but the numbers are certainly in decline, and we're not seeing a great rush into the Jehovah's Witnesses as a result of this increase, this apparent increase in the number of hours each publisher is putting in. So we don't know. I mean, maybe these publishers are, jacking the numbers up. Who knows? But we're not seeing any results as far as this increase is concerned. And this is what I'm talking about. This chart here is a preaching effectiveness, again, a 5-year rolling average. This is the number of baptisms. This relates to the number of baptisms each month or per month per the number of hours preached per month by each publisher. So this relates the number of baptisms reported each year to the number of hours that each publisher is putting in. And you can see what I'm talking about in the previous slide. I was kind of jumping ahead because that previous slide just shows an increase in the number of the hours that the publishers are putting in. And actually a substantial increase, because it went from 13 hours to 21 hours or so. And that's an 8-hour a month increase. And that's a substantial increase. And when you multiply that by 8 million people, you'd think that there'd be some results. Again, this goes back 60 years. You can see how the 1975 message, that early blip there in the 1970s, peaks out around 1975. And you could see that there was some effectiveness. There was a great deal of zeal that occurred in the 1960s and 70s, when everybody was all expecting the world to end, and the Watchtower was really going gangbusters in their witness work. And then you see the big decline, the great disappointment that took place in the subsequent half of the 1970s. And then you began to see that crawl back to growth again, and it took a number of years. It took a good decade and a half to recover, and it peaked out around the end of the 1990s, and then there was a slow, steady decline. And that arrow that I show here is pointing to that area of decline from the late 1990s to the present time. And we have a chart that takes a look at that period specifically. So we've got the broader time period here from 1960 to the present, and we see that despite the substantial increase in the number of hours put in, there has been a steady decline in the results. In other words, the number of baptisms are not responding to the increase in the number of hours given to witnessing. And so this is an interesting, very interesting chart. The internet really began in you could see that around 2010 that there might have been a little upturn there, but then from 2010 to the present, there's been a steady decline, and I think that's definitely attributable uh, to the activism that's taken place, the internet and its impact on the witnesses and the impact ex witnesses are having on the growth of the movement. And you could see that they were trying to make a turnaround there. That between 2000 and 2010, there was a bit of a jog up, but then boom, you're back again to a steady and steep decline. And now this we'll take a look at that in the next image a little bit more closely. Now, this is my last chart that I'm going to throw up in this presentation, but this just looks at that segment of the previous chart from 2000 to the present. And you can see here that we've got a pretty linear decline. There was a little flattening, a little increase that took place between 2005 and 2010, but that again, that reversed itself, and you can see that it's a steady decline. And it's a pretty linear decline at this point. We've got a correlation coefficient of about zero point 0.8. This is a 5-year rolling average, so again, it's smoothed out. The data's smoothed a little bit, but a zero point 0.8 correlation coefficient isn't bad. It represents a relatively tight fit. What it indicates is that what decline we do see is attributable to the ineffectiveness, the decline in effectiveness of the preaching effort, the witness effort during that period of time, and that is the principal variable involved in the decline. So we don't, with the internet, we could see this decline become steeper over time. I don't expect to see the Watchtower unless there's a great sign from heaven and we see Jehovah like the Monty Python in the clouds with the wooden jaw that moves up and down like a nutcracker, and but I don't expect that we'll see any such sights in the heavens, and that people are going to learn more and more of the abuses of the Watchtower Society. The Watchtower Society is going to fall even further into financial trouble. Its publicity with the child sex abuse is going to continue to dog them, to plague them. And I think the number of individuals who join the Watchtower will continue to fall, especially as knowledge and the internet begins to spread more widely across the globe and reach more and more people, which it's doing. It's something that is in the works. So this is all I've got at this point in terms of graphics. Well, I'm having trouble with this video editor again, so I'm not going to get a shot of me talking to you, and it's just as well. I hope you all found this beneficial, that this analysis has provided some interesting insight into what's happening with the Watchtower, that it is indeed, the activism is indeed having an impact. All of the many things that are happening in these recent years, the sex abuse trials, the penalties that are being levied against Watchtower are having an impact. And I think most of all, the greatest impact is the voice are the voices of all of the activists that speak out against Watchtower abuses. And until that day comes, I think Watchtower will continue to pay the price and will find it difficult to overcome the voices of those that have been hurt and victimized by the Watchtower Society. So until next time, this is Truth Seeker wishing you all the best. And again, my thanks to Unreluctant for sending me this information so freely and so responsively. Thank you very much.